30 men were lost at sea for weeks after a storm pushed their ship far off course. When they finally reached land, they expected water, shelter, maybe food. Instead, on a remote island, they were led to a man bound in iron chains, alone, waiting. He did not ask for help. He did not explain who he was. He asked them questions, precise questions, about real places, real people, and events happening far beyond that island. And when they later reported this encounter, the account was publicly confirmed and preserved in one of the most critically authenticated sources in Islamic history. So who was this man? Why was he restrained? And how did he already know what was happening in the outside world? Before we examine the evidence step by step, like this video. Subscribe to Infinity. Share it with someone who values verified history over exaggeration. Now, let's begin. Tamim ibn al-Dari left the shore the way he always did, with calculation, not anticipation. He was a trader by profession, accustomed to measuring risk, counting cargo, and trusting routes that had served merchants for generations. This voyage was not meant to be remembered. He was accompanied by 30 men, all from the Arab tribes of Lak men Judum. These were not dreamers or adventurers. They were men who understood fatigue, scarcity, and the discipline required to survive long journeys. Every one of them had crossed difficult terrain before, by land and by sea. Their purpose was commercial. No source suggests curiosity, exploration, or deviation from known maritime paths. The Eastern Mediterranean was familiar to traders like them, mapped by experience rather than charts, and governed by seasons that usually obeyed expectation. The change came without warning. The wind shifted first, not violently, but persistently. What could have been dismissed as rough weather stretched into hours, then days. Sails strained. Adjustments stopped working. The sea no longer responded to experience. As conditions worsened, the ship lost its ability to hold direction. Steering became guesswork. Landmarks vanished. At night, even the stars offered little guidance as cloud cover and motion disoriented them. Navigation, the trader's greatest asset, failed completely. Time became difficult to measure. Days passed without progress. Then weeks. Provisions were rationed. Conversation thinned. The men stopped asking where they were and focused instead on staying afloat. The sea had stripped them of control. At this stage, there were no decisions left to make. They could not turn back. They could not correct course. The voyage had shifted from movement to endurance, from intention to survival. After nearly a full month, the storm's force began to weaken, not because they had escaped it, but because it had carried them elsewhere. The sea that had imprisoned them now pushed them forward with unfamiliar urgency. Then land appeared. An island, rising from the water without recognition. Relief spread through the ship, followed immediately by caution. Unknown land offered no guarantee of safety. It could mean shelter, or it could mean a new kind of danger. They anchored and prepared to disembark before nightfall. Weapons were readied. Roles were assumed without discussion. None of them spoke of omens or destiny. But as they stepped onto that shore, it was already clear that this landing would not end with rest, and that the sea had not delivered them there by accident. What awaited them on that island would not ask who they were, only what they knew. They disembarked before sunset, moving quickly but carefully. The light was already shifting, and no one wanted to be exposed on unfamiliar ground after dark. Their first task was practical: identify shelter, fresh water, or any sign that the island could support life. The shoreline gave them nothing. No smoke. No structures. No sound of animals or people. The island neither welcomed them nor resisted them. It simply remained still, as if indifferent to their arrival. They moved inland as a group, close enough to hear one another breathe. Every footstep felt louder than it should have. The absence of noise sharpened their attention. Even the wind seemed restrained, as though the island itself was listening. Then something moved. It did not emerge suddenly or charge toward them. It approached at a controlled pace, close enough to be seen clearly, but not close enough to be understood. At first glance, they could not classify it, and that uncertainty was immediate and unsettling. Its body was entirely covered in hair. Not patches. Not clothing. Hair so dense that they could not distinguish where its face began, where its limbs ended, or even which side of it was facing them. The usual markers that allow a human mind to assess threat were absent. Fear did not develop gradually. It arrived fully formed. These were men familiar with danger, yet this encounter bypassed experience. They did not whisper or hesitate. They raised their voices and demanded to know what stood before them. The response came without agitation. The creature spoke, clearly, calmly, and without surprise at being addressed. The sound of a voice coming from something so visually unidentifiable deepened the shock rather than easing it. It identified itself as Al-Jassasa. Then, without explanation or introduction, it delivered a statement that immediately shifted their understanding of the island. There was a man farther inland, and he was waiting for them. The words changed the situation completely. This was not an accidental encounter. Their arrival had been anticipated. The island was not empty, and whatever governed it already knew they were there. They had not discovered the island. The island had received them. Being told that someone was waiting stripped the situation of chance. Until that moment, the island could still be dismissed as an accident of weather. Now, intention had entered the scene. Whatever lay ahead was not reacting to their arrival, it had anticipated it. The men stopped moving. They exchanged glances, not words. Instinct urged retreat, but reason offered no safer alternative. Returning to the ship meant trusting a sea that had already abandoned them once. Staying on the island carried its own risk. They knew nothing of the terrain, nothing of who, or what, lived there. Yet the direction they had been given was precise, delivered without hesitation, as if delay had already been accounted for. They chose to move forward. Not because they were fearless, but because uncertainty behind them felt no less dangerous than uncertainty ahead. They advanced inland cautiously, maintaining formation. The silence remained intact. No movement followed them. No voice guided them further. The island offered no reassurance, only space. The cave revealed itself without warning. Vast and untouched, it felt less like a natural hollow and more like a hidden chamber carved with intention. There were no torches, no markings, no signs of life. The silence inside did not echo, it swallowed sound. And that silence was more disturbing than any visible danger. They entered carefully. Inside, the air was still. The space was enclosed, controlled, and focused toward a single figure seated within. The man was restrained with iron. His hands were bound up toward his neck. His legs were chained firmly, limiting movement but not posture. The restraints were functional, not improvised, placed to hold, not to punish. He looked at them directly. There was no shock in his expression. No confusion. No reaction to their number or their weapons. His gaze suggested recognition, not of their faces, but of the moment itself. He did not ask who they were. He did not ask how they had arrived. The encounter unfolded as if the questions had already been answered elsewhere. Before any of them could speak, before fear could turn into inquiry, he spoke first. And the questions he asked would reveal that this meeting had never been about them at all. He did not ask who they were or how they had arrived. His first question concerned Bain, a fertile region in Palestine known for its date palms. He asked directly whether its trees were still producing fruit. The specificity of the question stood out. This was a real place, with real agricultural output, known to traders and travelers. They answered without hesitation, yes, the date palms of Bain were still fruitful. The man paused briefly, then said with certainty, soon they will not. He offered no reasoning, no detail, no context, only a conclusion, delivered as fact. He moved on without acknowledging their reaction. Next, he asked about Lake Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee. He wanted to know whether its waters were still abundant. Again, the question was practical, verifiable, and tied to the livelihoods of surrounding communities. They confirmed that the lake was full. The response came immediately, soon it will dry. At this point, the pattern was undeniable. These were not predictions meant to impress. They were checkpoints, conditions being verified. Then came the question that silenced the group. He asked about a man in Arabia, whether he had appeared, whether people were following him, and whether the Arabs had accepted his authority. There was no ambiguity about who was being referenced. Tamim answered truthfully, yes, he had appeared, yes, people were following him, Yes, his message was spreading and gaining strength. For the first time, the man in chains reacted, not with fear or anger, but with sharpened attention. "That is better for them," he said. Then, without hesitation or drama, he identified himself as al-Masih ad-Dajjal. He explained that he was restrained, awaiting permission to emerge, and that his movement was currently limited by decree. The declaration reframed everything instantly. The chains were no longer a mystery. The isolation was no longer accidental. The questions were no longer theoretical. This was not a prisoner seeking escape. It was a figure held back, watching for signs that his time was approaching. Before they left, he issued a final warning. He stated that he would eventually be allowed to travel across the earth, entering every land except Mecca and Medina, which would remain forbidden to him. There was nothing more to ask. No argument. No confrontation. The men understood that the encounter had reached its limit. They turned back toward the path that led to their boat. As the island receded behind them, the weight of what they had heard did not lessen. They carried with them not a story to be told casually, but a testimony that demanded verification. That verification would not happen at sea, but in Medina, before the Prophet himself, where this private encounter would be transformed into a public, authenticated warning. They left the island without discussion. Not because there was nothing to say, but because every man understood that words, spoken too quickly, could weaken what they had just encountered. The sail caught the wind, the oars moved in rhythm, yet the silence on the boat was heavier than the storm that had carried them there. The island disappeared behind them, but it did not loosen its grip. Each man replayed the encounter in his own mind, the chains, the questions, the certainty. No one suggested alternate explanations. No one tried to rationalize it away. What they had witnessed resisted casual interpretation. Days passed at sea. The routine of survival returned, navigation, provisions, watches, but the memory did not fade. Instead, it sharpened. The farther they traveled from the island, the more deliberate the encounter felt, as though distance itself were testing whether they would dismiss it. When they finally reached inhabited land, normal life resumed around them. Markets opened. Ships docked. Conversations filled the air. But for Tamim al-Dari, the familiar rhythms no longer carried the same weight. He had crossed from experience into responsibility. This was not a story to be shared for attention. Tamim understood that careless repetition would reduce it to rumor. What he carried required authority, someone who could confirm it or dismiss it without hesitation. Sometime later, Tamim embraced Islam. This decision did not erase his past, it reframed it. When he traveled to Medina, he arrived not only as a believer, but as a witness, carrying an account he knew could not remain private. He requested to speak directly to the Prophet Muhammad. When he began to recount the journey, the storm, the island, the creature, the man in chains, the questions, he spoke with restraint. He avoided emphasis. He avoided interpretation. He reported events as they occurred, knowing that credibility depended on precision. The Prophet listened attentively. He did not interrupt. He did not question details. He did not display surprise. For those present, this composure was striking. When Tamim finished, there was no correction, and no dismissal. Instead, the Prophet gathered the people of Medina in the mosque. Men and women assembled, aware that this was not a routine address. The Prophet then retold Tamim's account publicly, confirming it in detail and declaring that it aligned exactly with what he had already taught about al-Dajjal. With that confirmation, the story crossed a threshold. What began as an isolated encounter at sea became a public testimony, preserved through transmission, examined by scholars, and embedded within the framework of prophetic warning. And so the story ended not with release, but with waiting. Not with answers, but with accountability. Because the real test was never the island, it was what people would do once they knew. This is not folklore. It is not a legend shaped by imagination. The story of Tamim al-Dari and the chained man on the island is preserved in a Muslim, one of the most rigorously authenticated collections of Hadith in Islamic scholarship. It was publicly confirmed by the Prophet Muhammad, and transmitted through verified chains of narration. If this kind of historically responsible source-based content matters to you, content grounded in authentic Islamic history and verified Hadith, then support the channel. Like the video. Share it with someone who values serious research. And subscribe to Infinity.